Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you to all of our online viewers for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Francesca and I'm the Marketing Specialist here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited to introduce today's presentation of a year in review, Cyber Trends in 2019. In this webinar, our speakers will discuss the threats that stood out in 2019 and their predictions for 2020. Our LookingGlass presenters for today's session are Neera Desai, Threat Researcher, and Marc Larson, Senior Threat Intelligence Analyst. Before we begin, I want to run through a few housekeeping notes and reminders for the BrightTalk webinar platform. Please note on screen that there is a chat window where you are free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters. We will be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A. If we happen to run out of time to go through all of the submitted questions, we will be sure to contact you directly following the presentation. Please note, any questions submitted through the chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments and we will contact you directly if desired. Also note the attachments and links section on your audience screen. We have a few resources for you to peruse at your convenience relevant to today's topic. Lastly, and very importantly, if you'd like to obtain 1 hour of CPE credit towards your professional certification for viewing today's webinar and did not enter your membership number when you signed up for this session, please send it to us via the chat window. All you have to do is simply enter your membership number and BrightTalk will tell us which viewer it came from. You can enter it at any time during the webinar. So without any further delay, I will go ahead and pass this over to our presenter to kick off today's webcast. Neera, take it away.
Great, thank you, Francesca, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. As Francesca said, my name is Neera Desai, and I am a threat researcher at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I joined LookingGlass in November of 2018 as a Senior Intelligence Analyst, and in September 2019, I joined the Threat Research team as a threat researcher. I've had 8 years of experience in cybersecurity, focusing on phishing, malware analysis, open source investigations, and digital forensics. I also have a bachelor's degree in computer and information sciences and a master's degree in computer forensics and security management, both from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And with that, let's get started with our list of topics. Okay, first on the list of topics is phishing. This slide has 3 images, starting from left to right. The left image is a screenshot of a credential phish landing page. The phish impersonates a Microsoft Office 365 login page. At first glance, this page looks similar, if not identical, to the real login page. However, if we look at the search bar, we can see the domain name is not microsoftonline.com or even associated with Microsoft by any means. The image in the middle is a screenshot of a phishing email received by one of our team members. The phish impersonates a Ring Central theme and uses a lure requiring the victim to view a quote-unquote recorded message. The image on the right is a screenshot of an article published by HelpNet Security on phishing being the highest level in 3 years, according to the Anti-Phishing Working Group, also known as APWG. I think one of the reasons why phishing has remained persistent and continues tricking targets into falling for phish is through social engineering. Phishing lures can range anywhere from the most simplistic message to sophisticated and alluring. Some actors take it one step further by incorporating social engineering techniques. This can include referring to the victim by first and last name or including the victim's title or place of work in the email, essentially incorporating any type of information that would make the victim believe the email comes from a legitimate source. Part of this is because threat actors will likely use an attack vector with a proven history of success. So if social engineering has proven to be effective in the past, threat actors can use it in the future and potentially add additional capabilities to the attack. With social engineering in mind, our next topic is business email compromise. There are 2 images on this slide. The image on the right is a screenshot of a blog published by our LookingGlass team on business email compromise in April 2019. The image on the left is taken from an article published by the FBI on the Internet Crime Complaint Center. The headline alone, "Business Email Compromise, the $26 billion scam," is astounding. And as the FBI claims, this figure was reported using statistics from a 3-year span, from June 2016 to July 2019. This PSA was published on September 2019, and I'm sure since then, this number continues to grow daily. Similar to phishing, social engineering plays a part in business email compromise. The whole concept of BEC is to scam those who perform transfer fund requests, work with tax statements like W-2 forms, or those who handle employees' personally identifiable information, PII. So threat actors are going to make BEC lures as convincing as possible with the hopes that the victim will fall for the scam. Last week, a friend and I were discussing the difference between spoofing and compromise. And I think one of the things that can make end users fall for BEC scams is the fact that sender email address is a legitimate address, specifically a compromised email address, hence business email compromise. Whereas spoofing is common with phishing emails as actors attempt to pass off spoofed information as legitimate. Our next topic is malware and ransomware. Some people like to differentiate between malware and ransomware. However, I've always associated ransomware as a subcategory of malware since it's a type of malware that also extorts its victims. Here we have 3 images. The image in the foreground is a ransom note obtained from an analysis I performed on the Ryuk ransomware. In the center lists the name of the ransomware. The bottom right has this phrase, bound to shadow universe. And finally, in the top left is the email address in which victims are required to email threat actors to negotiate payment. We'll get into this in a bit. The image on the left is a headline from an article in which Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, was the subject of spam emails distributed by the Emotet botnet days before Christmas 2019. Emotet is a botnet that has made waves in 2019 due to its persistence as well as its multiple capabilities, including acting as a downloader to obtain and run additional malware during an infection chain. One of the malware families it started to include in its infection chain is the TrickBot banking Trojan. This malware collects sensitive information, primarily financial information, and reports its findings back to the threat actors to carry out nefarious activity. Now back to ransomware. This other image is of an article published by the New York Times about the ransomware attack on Baltimore that happened in May 2019, in which Baltimore became a victim of the Robinhood ransomware, and they were demanded to pay 13 Bitcoin, which at the time was roughly $72,280 to aid in restoring access to their computer systems. One thing that I've noticed during 2019 and even during 2018 is that ransomware has expanded its pool of targets. Now let's be honest, anyone can be a victim of ransomware. Back in 2016, when ransomware was on the rise, we saw attacks on the healthcare industry, specifically hospitals. There were even large-scale attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya in 2017. Last year, the city of Atlanta, Georgia became the victim of the SamSam ransomware. In 2019, we saw ransomware attacks not only on Baltimore, but also local government offices, schools, cities, and counties, as well as healthcare providers. Some of those infections are attributed to the Ryuk ransomware, hence the ransom note in the foreground. I think part of this plays into the ransomware as a service economy for 2 reasons. 1, there's value in the data obtained from ransomware infections. And 2, with the rise of the value of cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, how can ransomware threat actors be sure the ransom will get paid if the victim can't afford to pay it? The victims are given the opportunity to communicate with threat actors via email or a messaging application to negotiate payment if they choose to pay the ransom. At the end of the day, some of these threat actors are trying to make a profit, and by using this as a service model, some victims are inclined to pay the ransom, especially if the encrypted files are valuable. Next on the list is the dark web. Segueing into another as-a-service economy, our next topic is the dark web. This slide contains a few images of known forums in which actors buy and sell credit card information, compromised accounts and data, personally identifiable information, PII, protected health information, PHI, and even software builds for specific malware families. Other sources aside from these forums include social media platforms and messaging applications. And on this slide, we have a couple of the marketplaces such as Joker Stash, Raid Forum, Exploit.in. So a couple of events occurred in relation to the dark web. In January 2019, the actor group known as the Dark Overlord threatened to release files related to the 9/11 attack unless their ransom demands were met. Joker Stash has been in the headlines a few times in 2019. One incident was when well over 1 million compromised credit card data had been added to the carding shop in the fall of 2019. The dark web utilizes an as-a-service economy with the buying and selling of valuable and often sensitive data. As briefly discussed in the previous section, threat actors are willing to pay a lot of money for valuable data. By accessing this data and selling it, they can both make profit by compromising their victims and selling their information to the highest bidder. Okay, next on we have the Internet of Things. So this slide has two images. On the left is a cartoon titled Bring IoT to Work. And it says, I connected my phone to the network and, one thing led to another, which is pretty funny. On the right is an article about how far we have come and how far we'll have to go when it comes to IoT security. For years now, we've been around smart devices ranging from phones, televisions, refrigerators, and even doorbells. With the intention is to help end users stay connected for communication and possibly in ease of availability. Can the same be said for its security? Threat actors will find ways to exploit vulnerabilities, especially in smart devices. In 2019, there were reports of threat actors hacking into camera and audio components of smart devices. Not only is this a security concern, but also a privacy concern, and emphasizes how we in the cybersecurity industry must ensure the security of these smart devices is satisfactory for our end users. The next topic is data breaches. This slide has 3 screenshots of articles depicting a few breaches that occurred in 2019. From left to right, we have the public announcement from Zynga, the online social gaming company known for games like Words with Friends, disclosing that player account information was accessed illegally by threat actors. In September 2019, DoorDash, the on-demand food delivery service, disclosed a security breach in which a third party gained unauthorized access to their system, including DoorDash user data. Finally, 2019 was the year of the biggest data breach, known as Collection 1, in which 2.7 billion email password pairs appeared on the dark web. Collection 1 was discovered in January 2019. However, similar sets of data were observed and named Collection 2, 3, 4, and 5, which combined together total to 25 billion email and password records. So it seems like almost every day a company is a victim of a data breach. Data breaches could occur for a number of reasons. LookingGlass published a blog on phishing when a cyber intelligence report stated that 93% of all breaches start with a phish. From that alone, a breach could occur from falling for a phishing attack, a malware infection, or even weak security infrastructure. However, the need for a robust cybersecurity posture is a must with today's threat landscape, ranging from cybersecurity awareness training, recognizing suspicious emails, reporting sketchy activity on your corporate device, essentially making sure you have a sturdy defense against a possible cyber attack. This brings us to our next topic, third-party risks. So there are 2 images on this slide. On the right is a service offering from LookingGlass Cyber Solutions related to third-party risks. On the left is an article discussing a visibility problem in third-party risk management. So as an organization, you could be a Fortune 500 company or a small to medium-sized business. You could even have the most robust security posture and infrastructure. But what's to say your vendors have similar posture and infrastructure? Almost every company uses a vendor for some type of business need, but we can't always be sure how secure that vendor's security is. Once again, data breaches are occurring frequently. In 2019, we saw a few cases in which an organization dealt with a data breach due to a vendor. It's become such an issue that LookingGlass offers a service focused around third-party risk management so that companies can address their cybersecurity hygiene as well as of their vendors. Finally, we have data privacy regulations. 2 images on this slide. On the left is a post about the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, And on the right is a post about the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. Both laws address consumer privacy, one in the European Union and the other in California, here stateside. With GDPR's introduction in 2018 and CCPA to launch 2020, these laws shape how information can be collected, stored, and shared. More importantly, they aim to address privacy concerns for consumers. Companies are required to get consumers' consent for any personal data they collect, specifically those in regions where data privacy laws are in effect. These laws address how these companies need to handle that information, specifically when it comes to security. Just to reiterate, data breaches are happening so frequently, and the last thing anyone wants is for their information to be compromised in any manner. So this concludes my section, and I will pass it to Marc Larson.
Yeah, thank you, Neera. As you can see on the slide there, my name is Marc Larson, and I am a Senior Intelligence Analyst here at LookingGlass. I've been employed with LookingGlass since 2012, but for the last 5.5 years, I've been a member of the Threat Analysis and Investigations team, where my focus is physical investigations, including threat actor profiles, pre-event security screenings and briefings for major events like the Super Bowl, World Economic Forum, Olympics, World Cup, stuff like that. I also handle person of interest investigations, and then another major part of my work is executive threat assessments, which stretches across many of LookingGlass's industry verticals. So what I'm going to actually be talking about today is some more physical security trends that we've seen back in 2019. And the first trend we're going to look at is political protests, which 2019 saw a large number of political protest actions that would be considered violent in nature, or at least disruptive in nature. This involves citizens taking to the streets to raise their voices against their government's inequality, corruption, and bad actions. While each protest has its own unique dynamic and goals, the protests that erupted throughout the world signaled critical shifts in the way in which governments and citizens relate. In some cases, mass protests ousted longtime leaders. This was the case when Iraq's Prime Minister Abdul Abdi Mahi resigned after calls for the end of the political system which existed since the U.S.-led invasion ousted Saddam Hussein, but has been marked by sectarian divides ever since. Also resigning was Lebanon's Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri amid protests over planned tax increases. However, the Prime Minister still remains in office today. Puerto Rico also saw the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rosello after mass protests erupted related to leaked messages revealing corruption and bigotry within the governor's office. But in other cases, mass protests failed in their intended outcomes. In Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro was expected to start his 6th term of office in January of 2019, violent protests threw his leadership into question with the rise of opposition leader Juan Guaido, who proclaimed presidency on constitutional grounds. While Guaido was recognized by many world leaders, including the United States, Maduro continued to act as president, and the situation remains volatile to this day. Other Latin American countries like Nicaragua and Ecuador saw mass protests that were stalled or shut down with excessive police force or government-led crackdowns on dissent. Then in the spring of 2019, thousands of protesters in Haiti spoke out against mass corruption committed against Haiti's political class. A group of young protesters known as the Petro Challengers had been fighting against the embezzlement of funds totaling well over $1 billion, which were received through Venezuela's discounted Petro-Caribe oil allowance program. And then across the world in Iran, a major fuel hike in December pushed protesters out into the streets across the country, only to be met with an internet blackout followed by bloody crackdown, killing dozens of protesters. And as protests continue in Iran to this day. It's also worth mentioning Hong Kong and France, which both took center stage in 2019 with major demonstration actions throughout the year. In Hong Kong, the demonstration started through an extradition bill that would have allowed for certain criminal suspects to be extradited to mainland China under certain circumstances, sparking mass student-led protests. Opponents of the bill said that it risked exposing Hong Kongers to unfair trials and violent treatment. They also argued it would give China greater influence over Hong Kong and could be used to target activists and journalists. When the protests began, they were nonviolent and rather actually peaceful. They became violent in October as thousands of Hong Kongers fought to push back against interference from Beijing under the promise of one country and two systems. An additional aspect to consider is up until 1997, Hong Kong was ruled by the British as a colony, but was returned later to China. Under the one country, two systems arrangement, Hong Kong has some autonomy, which includes its own judiciary and a separate legal system from mainland China. But because this agreement expires in 2047, many Hong Kongers today are looking to capitalize on the momentum of past protests this year, or in 2019, and are pushing for full freedom from China. Then in France, the Yellow Vest protesters continued to be noteworthy in 2019 due to their size and the disruption caused. The movement began in 2018 and was initially motivated by France's rise in fuel prices and a high cost of living that many perceived was placing a disproportionate burden on the working and middle classes, especially citizens in rural areas. The protests snowballed into wider movements against President Emmanuel Macron and his perceived bias in favor of the elite and well-off city dwellers. The Yellow Vest movement takes its name from the high visibility jackets all motorists are required to transport in their cars, which protesters have adopted as a symbol of their fight. After nearly a year straight of frequently violent anti-government marches held on Saturdays, the French president promised a series of debates to quell the dissent, but Yellow Vest protests continue to remain active to this day. Also noteworthy in 2019 was the climate protests that we saw across the world. This included and sort of culminated with the Global Week of Future, which took place from September 20th to September 22nd and took place in over 150 countries. While exact numbers are difficult to determine, it was announced that during this Global Week of Climate Strikes, over 7.6 million people held demonstrations in streets across the globe, many of which were spurred by high-profile individuals encouraging the actions. Another aspect of physical security trends that we viewed over 2019 was this idea of executive targeting. And looking back at 2019, we were shown that there's many cyber threats facing organizations from today, including nation states, activists, a lot of the stuff that Neera talked about. But it should become as little surprise that senior level executives are becoming targeted more and more due to their position and power that they hold and the information that they have. And contrary to what a lot of people think about executive protection, it's not just bodyguarding or keeping unwanted attention away. It also involves advanced preparations, mitigation of risks, and viewing the exposure of the individual and their family throughout the entire security spectrum, not just when they're in the office, but also at home. This entails advanced preparation, whether you're talking about physical security around the residence or around their physical office building, but also technical security policies and procedures that would alleviate any cyber risk. And successful implementation of these things will differentiate security teams between effective security protection and security that is really nothing more than security theater. And as you see on this slide, LookingGlass observed the continuation of a trend that highlights the relationship between digital security and physical security. As more and more physical security failures and lapses are occurring because of failures and lapses in digital security. Whether it be an executive disclosing their physical future location in a social media post online, allowing them to be targeted at that location, or threat actors gaining control of residential access systems through an executive's password reuse habits, this relationship between physical and digital security continues to blend and get closer. And C-level executives will always be a prime target for cyber criminals and criminals in general. According to the 2019 edition of Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report, executives saw a 1,200% increase in targeting of social incidents or smaller, less impactful incidents, and a 900% increase in social breaches. And in this targeting, Verizon also determined that 71% of all these breaches had a financial motive. And a lot of the reason for this is because senior executives have top-level access and are higher up in the chain of command to make and approve requests. And their email login credentials are very attractive to cyber criminals. As Neera pointed out, phishing and vishing are commonly used by attackers to steal an executive's credentials. One of the reasons for this is because of the sheer volume of emails that senior executives handle. They routinely respond to multiple issues that demand quick resolution on a daily basis, which in turn creates an environment that is conducive to click before thinking. 2019 also saw the first reported incidents of a deep fake being used in a business email compromise-like scam. This case out of the United Kingdom saw the CEO of an energy firm tricked into believing that he was on the phone with his boss, the chief executive of the firm's German parent company. And according to the victim, the voice, the mannerisms, and the vernacular was identical to his boss. The scammer instructed the CEO to immediately transfer approximately $243,000 to the bank account of a Hungarian supplier, which in fact was a bank account operated by the scammer. And that was a successful attack. There's likely been more deepfake attacks that have been used, but this is the first one that has been reported, and really the only one that's been reported in major international news. It's also beneficial to look at executives on social media, and there's a lot of concern these days about social media and security, and most of this has to do with the security of personal data. Common questions that security professionals can ask are, can hackers get into an account? What happens if they do gain access? Or in other words, what will they do with our data or with the executive data? And this is sort of a worst case scenario thinking, is what happens if this data is lost? It's beneficial to think that way. And finally, it's beneficial to ask the questions, what am I or the person I'm protecting doing to protect this data? And unfortunately, in most cases, the answer to the last question is not enough. And one trend that we've seen in many executives, especially senior ones, is that they realize that they themselves are oftentimes synonymous with their brand. So because of this, they feel pressured to be approachable on social media and in other online sources. And in attempting to be more approachable, the executive may innocuously post something that places them or their family at risk. And as we all know, once something is posted online, it's very difficult to remove. We've seen a number of high-profile incidents where executives and high-net-worth individuals had their homes burglarized or their digital information taken by outsiders. There's a few examples there on your screen. In each of these cases, the victim had vulnerabilities exploited by outsiders, causing the loss of either their electronic information or physical goods or money. And in that bottom example there, in the case of the London burglaries, jewelry believed to be worth tens of millions of dollars was stolen from the house of British billionaire heiress Tamara Ecclestone, whose father is the former chief executive of Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone. Their home was burglarized shortly after they left to visit another country for the Christmas holidays. And police believe that the thieves were able to track Mrs. Ecclestone's movement on social media, and they also used public documents that the couple had filed with local authorities during a planned renovation. These documents displayed blueprints of the house, which included locations of internal safes, as well as the house's security systems. It's also beneficial to look at executives' families. And in 2019, the executives' families were also targeted. While executives themselves may be instructed and trained in how to protect their private information online, oftentimes their families are not. And unfortunately, because of this, the leak of an executive's private information frequently comes from disclosures by a close family member or friend. LookingGlass frequently comes across instances where an executive's cyber footprint is relatively small and well-maintained, but the same can't be said about their spouses or their kids. And oftentimes, disclosures posted by their spouse or kid is then used and weaponized by a threat actor to target the executive him or herself. And in this day and age where social media saturation and oversharing is commonplace, a company's executive protection policy should always include the executive's family. They need to be instructed why data privacy and protection is important and fully understand the limits of their sharing. And in this example you'll see here, an executive's son is sharing that they are staying at the Hilton Hawaiian Village in Honolulu. It's pretty easy to view this and see the type of information that a threat actor can use against the executive or his or her family. The threat actor could exploit this and determine that the executive is actually not at home, potentially opening up their house to be burglarized, sort of what we saw in London last month. They could also contact the hotel itself and get personal information on the executive. Oftentimes when you call the front desks of these hotels, they don't really check that it's you, and they can give you information out online. A threat actor could also contact the staff of the executive at his or her employer with a phishing or vishing attack using the information gathered. That's a lot of the business email compromises can start that way as well. And looking at some examples of the types of situations LookingGlass saw in 2019, these are all examples that we identified through our executive threat assessments and different work that we've done of an executive's child or family member posting potentially exploitable information publicly online. And it's not difficult to see how this content could be used against an executive. Not only is there a security risk, but it's also reputational risks. We came across incidences where the executive's kids were flaunting illegal drug activity online, or even suggesting that there was illegal activity at their parents' employer. So family members certainly need to be instructed in proper online hygiene in order for the executive to continue to operate properly online. Now I'm actually going to turn it back over to Neera, who's going to go over some of the cyber predictions for 2020.
Thanks, Mark. So these are some of the 2020 predictions we have on the information security side of the house. Ultimately, I believe that whatever we were seeing in 2019 will continue to persist or increase to a higher volume. First and foremost, there's going to be a continuation of social engineering tactics used to distribute phishing and business email compromise alerts. Ransomware will persist. Its pool of targets might expand, however, ransomware will continue on. The dark web's as-a-service economy will persist. There will be an increase in CVEs. Again, threat actors will find vulnerabilities and flaws in software to exploit and potentially leverage attacks using those vulnerabilities. There's also going to be an increase in security concerns around information technology, IT, operational technology, OT, and the Internet of Things, IoT. Weaponization of the Internet. We have a few major events coming up in 2020. We can expect to see a surge of bot accounts and rogue advertisements, especially with the presidential election here in the U.S. later this year. I also think there's going to be more awareness and regulations surrounding data privacy. With the launch of California's Consumer Privacy Act, it's likely we'll see other states and even other regions drafting their own legislation. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Neera. And as Neera, for the physical security protections, as Neera mentioned, 2020 will see several major world events. which will likely see increased demonstration activity, especially around the more political events like the 2020 presidential election, the UN Climate Change Summit in Scotland, and also the G20 Summit, which is scheduled for Saudi Arabia. There's also some major sporting events that are happening in 2020, including the Olympics in Tokyo, the UEFA Euro 2020 soccer tournament, which is actually being held across the European continent, including in Great Britain, which will be the first major event that will happen after Brexit. And there's also the 2020 Copa America, and the Americas soccer tournament as well. LookingGlass also predicts that the upward trend of targeting executives will continue. However, we expect this targeting to transition more and more into exploiting the executive's personal life as companies continue to harden the security around the executive in the corporate office. Many companies that we're seeing know that they need to have firewalls and physical security in the office. So that's sort of causing threat actors to move to the path of least resistance. So we're seeing threat actors targeting executives at their homes and in their private lives more and more. And they're looking to exploit family relationships and friend relationships as they're trying to get into a position to target the executive him or herself. So we expect these trends to likely continue, and will likely continue even beyond 2020 as a lot of the things that Neera talked about, such as the Internet of Things, continues to be integrated more and more into the lives of people. And that actually closes out our predictions for 2020.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. We're going to move to the Q&A. So it looks like we have a few questions from the audience. The first being for Mark. Are there any programs or specific resources you would recommend to reduce physical risk?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one of the best ways for mitigating physical risk is to establish a robust intelligence plan that monitors not only the physical risk inside the country, but also the executive's cyber risk as well. So that would be like the surface internet, social media, the deep and dark web. And they're really looking for indicators of threats such as physical threats of physical violence against the executive or individual themselves, disclosures of their personal information, trying to limit that. Also exploring just what's out there geopolitically as well. There's been instances where executives have been thrown into situations where they had very little to do with. Like we saw when, after President Trump was elected, a lot of the executives that were on some of his transitional team, or like a finance team or an economy team that were more or less advisors to him, a lot of those individuals that were CEOs of major companies faced a lot of grief because of that. So just recognizing that those types of threats are out there. So there's obviously programs such as LookingGlass's physical security monitoring services that provides a more holistic look at the threat landscape. And it provides actionable intelligence to a company's management that will allow them to better protect customers, employees, as well as protect their physical facilities against risks that are out there in the wild.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, next question is for Neera. Do you think we are going to see more ransomware attacks targeting cities and municipal organizations in 2020?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and I think it's likely, just given what occurred in 2019 and in 2018 with ransomware attacks on small cities and even large cities, counties, and even schools for that matter. I think it's likely. Another thing to consider is specific ransomware variants. So earlier I had mentioned the Ryuk ransomware, which in the third quarter and into the fourth quarter of 2019, we saw a couple of incidents in which Ryuk was responsible for causing ransomware attacks on certain small cities and counties as well. So I definitely believe that that might be something that can occur this year, and it's just important for the end users to stay vigilant and try not to click on any suspicious messages that they see and report suspicious activity on their corporate devices.
All right. Looks like we'll have a busy 2020. The third question is another question for Marc. What can executives do to remain safe while traveling overseas?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. Honestly, I think the best thing that executives and those in charge of protecting them can do is to do research prior to traveling. Those that are traveling, and especially those that are protecting them, people that are traveling, should understand political situations. If you're going to a historical area that sees a lot of unrest, you should understand what that unrest is and where it's located. Oftentimes, it's somewhat predictable, not always, but it's beneficial to understand those situations. It's also beneficial to understand cultural norms and where it's safe and unsafe to travel to. Cultural norms will really set a person out, where if they are acting a way that isn't culturally acceptable, they could find themselves targeted, not just physically, but in other ways as well. And a lot of this is really common sense, but it oftentimes is beneficial to be reminded of. So if someone's trying to put together sort of a travel assessment or a pre-travel assessment, it's beneficial to put the common sense stuff in there because it oftentimes, the common sense stuff is really the best practices. And it's also beneficial to understand and respect the risk of theft. This includes the theft of physical goods, but especially the theft of data and information. Executives, they need their laptops, they need their mobile devices and their smartphones to be able to work on the go. But oftentimes these devices, they hold valuable company information, contacts, emails, photos, and oftentimes personal information. Just understanding that even the smallest piece of information, such as a name, a person's position, the email address, or location, could be used for a criminal's advantage. And don't bring anything that they don't need overseas. And when they're packing or when they're bringing, digital stuff with them, do so in the pretext that this might be lost or this might be intercepted along the way. And if there's proprietary or sensitive information that they are bringing with them, maybe keep it on a separate device or maybe even like a thumb drive or USB drive. That way it's a lot easier to maintain possession of that. If your laptop is stolen, that important information isn't lost. The information will at least stay with you, and it's a lot easier to hold that small piece, that small USB drive on you than it is a full laptop. And keeping all this in mind, it's really best just to maybe keep a low profile while traveling and be mindful of what people are wearing, their bags, or what their gadgets are telling others. One of the biggest reasons for petty theft when people are traveling is showing of wealth. And the showing of wealth will oftentimes make you more appealing to scammers and to pickpockets. So there's really there's a plethora of things that people can do, but it really falls into common sense, and it falls into developing a program before you travel, well before you travel, so that you can fully explore the situation there and provide recommendations for if this happens or if self-service goes down, this is what you're supposed to do, so that the executive or the principal that you're protecting understands what happens. They don't have to contact you to know what to do.
Okay, thank you, Marc. All right, we have one more question from the audience. It is, can we expect an increase in phishing attacks given the situation with Iran?
Ooh, that's a good question. I will say that it's possible. Obviously, we don't know what could occur. In the headlines, I know that there's been a few articles out there saying, mentioning website defacements. That's something that I've definitely seen on the phishing side of things as far as credential phishing URLs go. seeing websites defaced with some type of hacktivist message to it. But it's possible, and as far as social engineering goes, once again, it's possible. And it's just one of those things where once again, it's important to stay vigilant. Know who's sending those emails, and just heed a little extra caution when interacting with anything that you could think, oh, well, is this suspicious or is it legit? So I definitely think it might be possible.
Okay, thank you, Neera. Well, that wraps up the Q&A for today's webinar. So thank you to Neera and Marc for today's great presentation, and thank you to everyone that attended today's webinar from LookingGlass. A link to the recording of today's webinar will be sent out to each of you tomorrow and will also be available on our website under the webinars page for additional viewing. Feel free to pass this along and share the presentation with your colleagues. Thank you for viewing.